Did Daesh die with Abu Bakr Al Baghdadi in Syria a year ago? Look 6,000 kilometers south, and the answer is no. Mozambique has seen as many as 300,000 people displaced in a violent insurgency. On this roundtable, how to stop IS destabilizing southern Africa. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm David Foster. Add to the violence the fact that the area of Mozambique worst hit is known for its gas, its diamonds and its gold. If Daesh does take control, it would have access to a great deal of wealth. Attacks by militants with links to Daesh began in the Mozambique province Cabo Delgado in 2017, but they've gathered pace this year. The militants seized key towns and targeted the military. Figures from the Armed Conflict Location and Events Data Project say more than 2,000 people have been killed. According to the World Food Programme, the fightings caused thousands to go hungry and 300,000 people have fled Cabo Delgado. The Mozambique government is finding it hard to tackle the issue alone and has asked the European Union to help. Observers fear these attacks could spread to other countries. So is Daesh a threat to the stability of southern Africa? Well, later on we'll be getting the international and the regional implications of all of this, but let's welcome to the program right now Zenaida Machado, Mozambique Researcher in the Africa Division at Human Rights Watch. She's in the country's capital, Maputo. Zenaida, very good to have you on the program. Do you know what conditions are like for civilians in that part of Mozambique that is most affected, Cabo Delgado up in the north of the country?
Thank you for having me. The situation is bad. And despite us hearing constantly from the government that there have been some military gains in Cabo Delgado, we continue to see people fleeing from areas of conflict. Just in the past week or so, we saw over 7,000 people arriving on the shores of a beach in the Pemba city, a beach called Pakiteke. And most of those people were women and children, and they arrived with injuries, dehydrated. Some of them had spent days traveling by boat. And as we conduct interviews with them, we are hearing gruesome stories of violence. They're talking to us about beheadings, sexual abuse, women being kidnapped. For what purpose, we cannot establish at this stage. So clearly what is going on the ground contradicts what the government is telling us about the gains they are making on the ground, or one would suspect that their military gains have not taken into consideration the humanitarian impact, and therefore they have spent most of their time fighting their enemy rather than finding ways of addressing the humanitarian crisis that is coming out of this conflict.
Does anybody doubt that this is Daesh, ISIS, some kind of offshoot of that group, or are there other insurgents there as well?
My understanding is that this group is primarily made of Mozambicans. It might be the case that over the past 3 years, which is exactly the time frame of this conflict, they have been able to pledge alliance to big groups like IS. But we know and we have seen from government addresses that among the group there are also foreigners. So a group that started from maybe a bunch of young disenfranchised people in Cabo Delgado has now become bigger than it was 3 years ago. And since then has also grown on strength. They started by simply attacking villages and killing people that were specific target because they were collaborating with the government. And now they are facing security forces. They are destroying schools. They are destroying hospitals. And we have seen recently ISIS using their ways of communication to actually claim some of those attacks.
Do they say what their eventual aim is?
Not that I'm aware of at this stage.
And what about the foreign fighters that have come in, the people who've got away from the area? What do they tell you about the foreign fighters?
What we hear about the foreign fighters is what the government is telling us, that this is mostly a conflict that is driven from outside. We have seen them detaining people from Tanzania, people from Uganda, people as far as Kenya in some cases. But in our work as researchers of human rights abuses, we have not come across any foreigner. Most of the people we have talked to, or all the people we have talked to, are Mozambicans.
Is the government, are the authorities in any way prepared for the number of internally displaced people, that there are 200 to 300,000 people and that number growing?
My fear at this stage is that the government doesn't seem prepared and is being caught by surprise more than once. In the most recent case, the one I just mentioned, is the case of people arriving in the beach. People started arriving on a Saturday. It was only on Monday, end of the morning, that the first team of health officials from the government arrived to start screening people, which meant that the people who arrived on Saturday and arrived on Sunday, and I'm talking about almost 2,000 people that arrived in a weekend, they arrived already with diseases. We don't know if they were carrying COVID-19. They were not screened. Some of them were visible, dehydrated, with some injuries, maybe that they sustained in some fighting going on down there where they came from. The point is that for over weekend, the people that took care of them were volunteers, not government officials. I think the problem now is that the government is taking too long to admit that it is unable to take care of all that wave of displaced people that are arriving in Cabo Delgado or in Pemba.
Zenaida Machado from Human Rights Watch, appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed. And of course, feeding those people and keeping them dry is going to be a major issue. We appreciate your time on this program.
Thank you.
Okay, well, right now on Roundtable, joining us from London, Alex Vines, Managing Director of Ethics, Risk and Resilience, who's also the Director of Africa Programme at Chatham House. In London as well, David Otto, Director of Global Risk International. And then we cross to Washington, D.C. to say hello to Dr. Gregory Pirio, the Director of Empowering Communication. Great to have you all on the programme. Alex, you first of all. Our previous guest talked about beheadings, about sexual abuse. Is there any doubt that this is Daesh or ISIS inspired?
Yeah, there is doubt. I think it's absolutely right to say that the roots of this thing are Mozambican, and that the conduct of the human rights abuses by the insurgents, most of the actors are Mozambican. There are some foreigners involved, particularly Tanzanians. But as it's developed over the years, it has begun to take on connections, including with IS, Daesh. And so there are a number of individuals that are inspired by that. But at base, it's fundamentally a Mozambican crisis rather than an international jihadi one.
But it is getting worse, certainly the violence and perhaps the infiltration from outside and the outside influences. Why would Daesh or IS followers be interested in what is a local dispute in Mozambique?
Well, it's a flag of convenience, and it's opportunity, it's opportunism, and it is ungoverned space. The northern districts of Cabo Delgado, some of them have never really had state authority there. They are they're vacuums where other things can take place, organized crime, and indeed now the growth of radical Islam. So it's not a surprise. This fits in a broader pattern that we see in the African continent, contested border areas that are often poorly governed. So it's not a great surprise to me that this is developed. The big surprise is that it's got as bad as it has so quickly. Nobody expected it to be as bad as it's become in 2020.
I'll ask you about how bad it has become just a little bit later, so we can get an idea of the scale. But David, Otto, do these people want to set up a caliphate, do you think?
I think it's all about the narrative, and as you well know, one of the successes or early successes of the so-called now defunct Islamic State was to talk about the establishment of a caliphate. That way, it draws into the sympathy of the vulnerable people that believe that a caliphate of that nature can be established. And this is the similar narrative which the local Mochababos, as they call them, or Al-Shabaab, that's what they're using. But of course, in order for you to successfully set up a caliphate, you've got to be able to not just have temporary control of that territory, but to be able to make sure that you can hold the territory permanently. The Islamic State itself, or the so-called Islamic State, did not succeed to maintain its caliphate. And I don't think the local jihadist group in Cabo Delgado will have the capacity to be able to establish.
But at the same time, the Mozambican military seem unable to get in control of the situation.
I think what you've got to understand is the asymmetric nature of these terrorist organizations. They depend largely on the human shield, but also they win the hearts and minds of the local population, like Alex said. Once there is an ungoverned space where there are existing grievances, it becomes very easy for the people to be able to support these movements. And terrorist organizations can only survive with the support of the local population. And where you have the existing push and pull factors, the government becomes the enemy of the people, and my enemy's enemy is my friend. So I think that is the same trajectory which we're seeing at the moment, established by this local jihadist organization with international affiliation to ISIS.
We're going to hear from the president of Mozambique in just a little while, but first, Dr. Pirio, Gregory, can I bring you in, because you know about the corporations, the foreign corporations that are working up in this area. It is potentially, at least, an extremely wealthy area in terms of its mineral deposits there, the gas it has, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, in fact, it's phenomenally rich in terms of natural resources. You have an amazing amount of gems that are being mined. You have a Mozambican company claiming that there is a huge amount of gold that can be mined there. And then we have the natural gas offshore and possibly onshore too. And the corporations have been investing there. Let me just say that the unfairness of the system to the local population has helped to fuel the discontentment with the government and the corporations. There are so many examples of this. In fact, the first recruits into the violent extremism organization were recruited from an area where the UK firm Gemsfield is operating, and where there have been allegedly abuses of torture and killings of the local population and of clandestine miners in these ruby mining areas. And so that's where reportedly the first recruits came from. And that fits into this whole narrative. What drives people to violence? The violence is often, almost always, from all my research in similar organizations in Africa, is a response to, it's a narrative of vengeance. That's how it starts out.
Yeah, so there's discontent amongst the locals. They are therefore easy pickings for anybody who wants to turn them towards their extreme views. And those extremists would have access to the wealth, the gems you talk about, the gas, the gold, etc., etc. So it's a dangerous cocktail.
Yes, what you have is an enormous illicit economy going on there. Illicit timber mining, you have illicit gem mining, you have gold mining taking place all illicitly. And I think you have to look at the violent extremist organization there trying to take advantage of it, certainly at least of charging those engaged in a fee for their operation in that, and so that there is an economic basis for which they can operate. And it's very similar to what's happened in the Sahel region with similar extremist organizations in that.
Let us bring in, not live, but recorded, the president of Mozambique, that is Filipe Nyusi. He was virtually addressing the UN General Assembly in September of this year.
The government has mobilized humanitarian assistance for the internally displaced people and promote socio-economic development activities for the communities. It was under these efforts that we recently launched and operationalized the Northern Region Integrated Development Agency, ADIN, with the aim of promoting multi-sectoral actions with a view to the integrated socio-economic development of the provinces of Niassa, Cabo Delgado, and Nampula, aware that the terrorist actions of which the country is a victim have links with international groups that are also involved in transnational organized crime. We have sought to address these phenomena in cooperation with other countries and regional and international organizations.
So there we have the president of Mozambique. He's appealing for international help, cooperation. I suppose he's concerned principally about his own country. But David, what about neighboring countries such as Tanzania to the north, South Africa? Worries about destabilization there?
I think my experience in the region, especially when I look at what happened in northern Nigeria, but also the Sahel, my first instinct is that when you begin to involve regional states, when you haven't actually built the capacity of Mozambique itself, it becomes a problem because in counterinsurgency or counterterrorism strategies, you've got to be able to have a framework in which regional states or international support can tap into. And when you don't have that, it's almost like you're asking for help when there is no framework on which anyone can help you. So I think if I were to advise him, the president of Mozambique, I'll let him know that the first task is for him to be able to establish, a civil military strategy within Mozambique itself, because this is where the first line of defense is, and this is where you can build up and show the regional partners that
But if there is a growing insurgency, if it is taking on more Daesh dimensions, then surely some kind of international coalition should be in place, or certainly agreed upon, to help combat that, Alex, as it was in Syria.
So, look, the first point is, I've made it already. This is a regional problem. It is not just about Cabo Delgado. It is about southern Tanzania. The roots of this go deep back, way before Gemfields and other companies. And so the question is how then to get a regional response to what is, the core is in Cabo Delgado, but it is a regional problem. And that certainly involves Tanzania. The Tanzanians are finally this year becoming much more engaged. And I think it's very telling that the operation that the insurgents have done that's been most virulent over the last month was actually into Tanzania, which resulted in a significant number of civilian casualties and has got an even stronger Tanzanian response.
And sorry to butt in, but is that because the insurgents want to spread their message across the borders, or they just don't recognize that there is a border as such?
Well, yeah, I mean, again, this is what we see in the Sahel and elsewhere. These are arbitrary borders created by the colonial project. You've got the Rovuma River, but when I've been up in those northern districts and along the Rovuma River, there's plenty of life going on and connections. They are meshed together with language and history. Swahili, for example, is a lingua franca of communication as well as other local languages. So, the way to deal with this will be considering this as a regional problem. And that will require the Southern African development community and international partners with experience of combating violent extremism and counterterrorism. And that is where we are at the moment. I think David's absolutely right. The Mozambican government is incredibly ill-equipped to deal with this crisis. It was already struggling with with the legacies of the civil war. And that was a middle-aged rebellion that's going on in central Mozambique. This is quite different and much more serious and worsening very, very quickly.
Okay, let's go to Gregory and ask him. Our first guest talked about the number of people who had to flee the area. 6,000 over one weekend, ending up sleeping on a beach, perhaps still sleeping on a beach. So there's the humanitarian side of this. Do you foresee more people having to leave the area? And the second one is, what about international investment? You've talked about the mineral wealth there. I read that Total, the French company, is investing $23 billion in the area. It could be a powder keg, both from a humanitarian point of view and an investment point of view.
Well, I think probably because of Total's investment there, they took over what had been an American corporation, Anadarko, started the investment there. That has got the interest of the Europeans in helping the Mozambican government find some kind of solution. And but I think it's important to that aid does get into the military in Mozambique, but there needs to be a way. It has to be done in a way to create a Mozambique security force that respects human rights, that understands how to do counterinsurgency, and it has to also be accompanied by a very vigorous program of engaging local communities and finding solutions to pull them away.
Well,
when
I suppose
people,
in a sense that is a long way off, because the conflict itself has to be brought under control, and the Mozambican authorities then can set about addressing some of the complaints. So my question for David Otto, sorry to cut you short, Gregory, but we're running a little bit short of time. My question for David is, if it has been getting materially worse in the last 6 months, is it only likely to deteriorate further?
That's always the trend. It goes back to, as a solution guy, I always look at, where's the solution? Now, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be a regional component of it, but what I'm saying is the situation is only going to get worse. But the only way forward that Mozambique can have an effective engagement from a military perspective, but also from a civil engagement, is to ensure that it has a credible, kind of an effective mechanism, to deal with the insurgency. I don't think it's something which international, help in terms of boots on the ground, of course, know that. But if you look at some of the interventions that are coming from South Africa, with private military firms from Russia, and also other sorts of organizations that are on ground, it tells you that there is no, everybody's doing the same thing, and nobody knows what anyone is doing. So
okay.
It will get worse if
all right, let's quick one for Alex, if I may. Yeah. David, thank you very much indeed. Should the outside world, that is outside Mozambique itself and perhaps outside Tanzania and bordering countries, should the outside world be worried about what is going on there?
Oh, certainly. We have suddenly a deteriorating security situation, creating over 250,000 internally displaced people, that is worsening very rapidly. And so this is a Mozambican problem. It's a regional problem, but it's increasingly an international one. And so Mozambique needs assistance. It needs help. It definitely needs training. And in the short term, I don't think they had any choice but to bring in private military contractors earlier this year. But that's only as a holding situation. The key here is about getting a more effective Mozambican security force to respond to this crisis. And I think David's right. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But David's also right that it can get better. This isn't going to just deteriorate consistently. There are ways of turning this around.
Any sign that outside help is coming other than through mercenary help?
Well, the European Union received a letter from President Nyusi asking for military training. In my view, that's very good. My worry is that the letter might not have got consensus within Frelimo. Historically, the party of government is very suspicious of taking Western support in particular, and so we'll have to see. But the government desperately needs international best practice support, both in terms of military strategy to respond to the insurgency, but also in terms of how do you get development into a very fragile, very dangerous, deteriorating security situation. Because you do need to win hearts and minds. You need to turn things around.
Well, I'm very sorry to butt in, but we have run out of time. Thank you very much indeed for joining us from London, from Washington, D.C., and earlier in the program from the capital of Mozambique, Maputo. And thank you, wherever you happen to be watching this edition of Roundtable. From me, David Foster, and the team that made this possible, we hope to have your company next time. Until then, goodbye.